role for government to play in the current system.
Well, government also has gotten too big and too powerful. You know, part of this economic lockdown.
There's been a revolution in gaming.
Democracy, poverty reduction, and cryptocurrency.
Communities get their own currency.
Decentralized social networks.
The first one is you mentioned that you saw these things in the 20th century, that there was so much wealth and yet so much inequality. And you mentioned land. And that made me think immediately of Henry George in the 19th century. Not many people know this today, but this was a best-selling book. I think it was Progress and Poverty was a book by Henry George, essentially concerning itself exactly with this question of how come there's so much plenty and yet so many people are still poor and inequality. And he had proposed, after surveying different ideas of his time, to tax the value, the unimproved value of the land. So whatever the land is, you tax it because you know where it is. So I wanted to ask, first of all, your position on his solution, and why do you think today a book that was endorsed by presidents and Leo Tolstoy and Milton Friedman and all these people has become virtually unknown today, and why do you think all of this is happening?
Yeah, well, I would go so far as to say that I am a Georgist. You know, I first learned about Henry George through my involvement with the School of Living starting in the late 1970s. And Henry George absolutely had a clear analysis of progress and poverty and the link between the two. And he realized that the land ownership was becoming more and more concentrated, and that in order to gain access, people had to pay rent to the landowners. And so his approach for solving that was to impose a land value tax. He argued that land is a commons. You know, nobody created the land. It was here before us. And basically land ownership has evolved through a process of war and confiscation and dispossession. You know, when the Europeans came to the American continent, we basically dispossessed the people that were already here. So, you know, with European monarchs granting land ownership to the new European immigrants, that was basically an outright confiscation of land from what we call the Indians or the Native Americans. So, you know, and there's been a saying that behind every great fortune is a great crime. And I think that is for the most part true. And sometimes the crimes are overt, sometimes they're covert, sometimes very subtle. So, yeah, we had this monopolization of land, and the popular board game Monopoly was actually invented by a Georgist to show the dysfunction of this land ownership pattern.
That's right. Many people don't know Monopoly was invented originally by a Georgist and not associated with her name, I think, but later with Hasbro or whoever she sold the rights to.
Parker Brothers eventually got it, and they've made tremendous amounts of money off of it. Actually, I did a modified Monopoly game. I called it Money Monopoly, where I tried to portray the dysfunctions inherent in the money system. And I've played that a few times with some people, and it really does show very quickly how everything gets tied up by the banking system when we have to borrow money into circulation and pay interest for it. Yeah, you were talking about Henry George. Well, Progress and Poverty was a best-selling book more than 100 years ago. And Henry George was very influential around the world at that time. But of course, what he had to say has been suppressed and not very popular by the landowning class, or I might say the elite ruling class, which now controls not only land but also money. And I heard recently that Bill Gates now owns something like 50% of all the farmland in the United States
50?
because he was able to accumulate tremendous amounts of monetary wealth to buy that land. So, you know, we've got this double monopoly of money and land, but there are other monopolies that are subsidiary to that. When you control the land and you control the money, what else? What else is there? You can control everything. You can control the politicians. You can control the news media. You control the educational system. This is where we're at. So I agree with you that we need to decentralize everything. I've been a decentralist for over 40 years because I see that our situation is the result of increasing complexity, increasing centralization, increasing concentration of wealth and power.
Decentralization can help solve some of these things, but at the same time, I also feel that people do amass power. And so under different systems, they amass power differently. So for example, Mark Zuckerberg starts Facebook, and he starts it just like I started my companies. And then he continues to own a majority share of the voting power indefinitely. And so if he decides that Facebook should do this or that, then people really need to reason with him or try to change his mind. Without that, Facebook, a publicly traded company that has many shareholders, would still concentrate all the decision-making power in one person, let's say. Now, sometimes it's not one person. Sometimes it's a board of several people, and they sit on other boards of other companies, and they sit on each other's boards. But at the end of the day, capitalism, let's say, leads to a capitalist class, or a class of people who sit on boards and make decisions about what companies will do. And sometimes those boards are beholden to the shareholders. And again, they hold a lot of shares. Obviously not the shareholders that have 5 shares, but the shareholders that have many shares. And sometimes those are pension funds and others, and they represent people. But at the end of the day, the decisions are being made by the people with a lot of shares, if you will. Okay, so that's capitalism. And it's essentially a system where private property, let's say, is generalized to ownership of really large things like cities and corporations. Like Disney World is probably a city that's run by a corporation that is actually administered by a board that is beholden to the shareholders who don't live in Disney World, right? So the incentives are that people outside Disney World call the shots of what happens in Disney World. So that's capitalism. When I say socialism, I don't mean necessarily what they had in the USSR or what they had in any particular country, which they call socialism or not. What I mean is that the share ownership of the organization is distributed as nearly equal per person as possible. So when I say democracy, the city is democratically, one person, one vote, that's what I mean, because the textbook definition is collectively owning the means of production. I think means of production is a very awkward word. So let's say collectively owning the organization that's supposed to organize people. So if you're collectively owning that, the idea is you can own it with shares unequally, or you can own it equally. So for example, housing cooperatives, food cooperatives, employee-owned corporations, companies, try to distribute the voting power almost equally, even if you're a janitor or even if you're a person that's been there for a few years. You don't really have that much disparity in your power. And of course, there's analogs of that with money, but I just first wanted to talk about voting and control. Where do you see yourself? Do you see benefits or drawbacks of essentially distributing power equally. And if someone tries to amass too much power, even if they started the company like I started my company, do you feel like they therefore should own it years later when it's worth billions of dollars, like Jeff Bezos? Should he get all the decision-making power over how that money that Amazon amasses will be used, or should it be done in a more democratic way? That's sort of how I would define that spectrum, if as it were.
I don't engage in ideological debates. I think that's a futile effort to get to where we need to go. Different people have different ideas what capitalism is, what socialism is. They all have attitudes about this thing bad, this thing good. I try to address the problems from the point of incentives and structures and systems. What's wrong with the incentives that are built into the system we have today, whether you call it capitalism or corporatism or whatever it is? The corporate charter is actually granted by government. So that's a socialistic element in our system. It basically does that on the idea that by providing the incentives for people to put their capital into this particular entity, people have to have the prospect of some reward. So you have a risk and reward situation, and the corporate charter encourages the risk by creating this limited liability of the structure. So if I put money into a corporation, your corporation or any corporation, as a shareholder, then my risk is limited to the amount of money that I've put in. It doesn't extend to my personal assets if the corporation fails or if the corporation does something that damages the common good. So this becomes the main consideration. There is a social cost to limited liability because, as we've seen many times in the past, if a corporation has limited liability and it does something that's harmful to society, it can declare bankruptcy and basically go out of business, and those who are damaged cannot get compensation or sufficient compensation for the damage that they have suffered. So, as I said before, corporations used to be limited in what they could do, how they could do it, and how long they could do it. But all of those constraints have been removed. So those constraints that were intended to protect the common good, to protect the public from excessive damage by corporations because of limited liability, those have been obliterated. So that's the problem. So how do we create incentives for people to invest without having this problem of damage to the common good?
Well, when you say damage to the common good, how would you define that the common good belongs to the people or the commons? Where do you draw the line? Is it a public good that's non-rivalrous and, the textbook definition, I guess, like air, water? How do you determine whether the public interest was, affected, let's say?
Well, the asbestos case might be instructive in this question. Asbestos was used widely in the 20th century until it was discovered that it caused cancer and lung problems. And then it was taken off the market after Many people had suffered physical harm and disease as a result of it, but the main asbestos producers went out of business, and there wasn't enough money left to adequately compensate the people that were harmed. Same with tobacco. The tobacco companies knew for a long, long time that tobacco was addictive, and they actually worked to make it more addictive. And they covered up evidence that it was harmful to people's health. I remember an ad from when I was young: more doctors smoke Camels than any other brand. So you have this kind of malfeasance and basically criminal activity, and very rarely are corporate executives held to account. Same thing with the financial crisis of 2008, 2009. The bankers that caused this crisis, they knowingly exploited the people that bought these mortgage-backed securities, and that was well told in the movie and the book, The Big Short. So you have all kinds of malfeasance that has gone unpublished and damage that has gone uncompensated. We still have lots of corporate pollution affecting, for example, fisheries. The small fishermen are put out of business by pollution of the environment, the oceans in particular, or the lakes, and there is no compensation for that unless the government steps in with some crumbs to help them recover and find another line of business.
So so basically your position is that there is a role for government to play in the current system.
Well, government also has gotten too big and too powerful. You know, part of this economic lockdown, the strategy of market closures in response to the pandemic, has been to make us ever more dependent on government handouts. Because when we can't sell our goods and services in the market, we depend on the government to inflate the currency and give us handouts to get by. But how long is that going to continue? What's going to be the overall impact of that? You know, you just can't keep printing more money. I mean, figuratively printing. It's not actually printing money. It's just creating deposits, so-called, putting them into your bank account. That's ultimately going to cause price inflation in basic commodities.
So let me actually.
So you have simultaneous inflation and depression.
So, okay, that's interesting. It almost like reminds me of stagflation that they had coined in the past, stagnation and inflation. Is that similar? What you're thinking of when you say depression and inflation?
Yeah, well, when people don't have jobs and can't earn a living, that's depression. When governments governments in the banking system inflate the money supply in the face of falling production, that's monetary inflation, which eventually causes price inflation.
So let me ask about this, because I think we're touching upon very interesting things that almost rely on these premises that there is a government and the government has the sole responsibility of issuing the money. And even if we go further back.
Well, the government doesn't issue the money. Actually, it's the banks that issue the money with government sanction and participation.
So right now, 95% of our money supply in dollars is issued as bank loans, essentially, right? Or bank credit. Yeah. And the banks originate this credit. Now we're going to get into the meat of what, you know, your views are of what we can do. But I just want to make it clear. The money supply that we're using to pay for goods and services on a daily basis is issued by private banks, or you could say publicly traded corporations, where the decisions are made by the banks as well as the central bank, trying essentially it's almost a governmental agency. The Federal Reserve System is a quasi-governmental agency, where the Federal Reserve System,
It's a private company, actually.
it's a private company, but it does have two mandates, right? To keep inflation low and to keep employment high. It does have mandates, at least in its charter.
They tell us it's actually, their role is actually to balance the two, to balance unemployment against inflation. It's basically when the money supply is inflated, it's taking value out of the economy, value that would ordinarily go to you and me and the rest of the consumers. So it's taking that value out of the economy. And so the government colludes with the banking system.
Mhm.
The banks get to earn interest on all of this money that they create, and the government gets to spend way beyond its tax revenues and use it however it likes.
So that extracts
To
money
bomb this
from,
country, that country, and wage wars.
in a way, that system of elites deciding how to distribute this newly created credit money is extractive, let's say, of the labor that is done in any system under by businesses or nonprofit organizations or others. When they take on a loan, first of all, the bank underwriters decide winners and losers, who gets the loan. And typically, if you get the loan, you're better off than if you didn't, especially if the interest rates are low, because then you have more capital to deploy, let's say, into bubbles like Bitcoin, or not necessarily bubbles in the pejorative sense, but just, there's a lot of money being printed. So on the one hand, you're getting loans that you can deploy, whereas others cannot, because you have cheap money because the bank underwriter said that you can have it. You've done that sale. On the other hand, you have the Federal Reserve System that's essentially selling treasuries in order to, they're doing open market operations in order to,
They're buying treasuries.
they're buying
Like
treasuries
never
and then
before.
selling them on the to others. But yeah, so the point is they're a market maker for US treasuries, if you will, right?
That's market manipulation.
And they're basically telling us that the US government will have all this money that they can then deploy for presumably good investment like infrastructure, roads, internet, or whatever. But they also
That's the window dressing. Most of it goes to their elite favorites.
So yeah, they have all these pork projects, and even if you look at the stimulus bill just a few months ago, it was loaded with all the kinds of things that they normally would. It was an omnibus bill, and even people online were like, "Oh, this bill funds other countries, and it helps fund the Space Museum or whatever." But the idea was that it was an omnibus bill, and politics tend to combine all these things into one thing. So it's all or nothing. You either sign the thing or you don't sign it. So it's a dysfunctional system where all of this gets either funded or not, and then people are almost like held hostage for that. So that's where I want to bring in cryptocurrency and kind of talk about this movement. I feel that was started with.
Let's talk about credit first, because credit is the essence of money.
Okay, go ahead.
When banks grant credit by making a loan, they're actually empowering someone to bring money into existence. No money is created until the loan proceeds are spent into the economy. And this is an important point that E.C. Regal made in his book, Private Enterprise Money. And it's very important to understand that the basis of money, whether it's fiat money issued by the government or central bank or the banking system, all money is basically based on credit. It's trusting people to provide goods and services in return for the money that's been created. So to make it very simple, let's suppose there were no banks. Let's suppose there were no money, that we lived in a society where everybody was both a producer and a consumer, which is basically the reality for most of the people in the world. infants, of course, are not productive. They're totally consumers. And invalids, likewise, are mostly consumers, and they don't produce anything. But the vast majority of the people are prosumers, as Alvin Toffler called them, producers and consumers, both. And so let's suppose we're all producing something and we want to trade with one another. Well, we can do a simple barter. I bake bread and I trade it to you for shoes that you make. But that's a very inefficient way of doing the exchange process because it depends on a coincidence of wants. You need to want bread and I need to want shoes. But we can collectivize this process by simply keeping a ledger of debits and credits. You want my bread? Okay, I'll sell you my bread and I'll get a credit from you, which I can use to buy something from somebody else in a wider circle.
Just a moment, just that one thing.
Eventually,
Yeah, just the one
those
clarification.
credits can circulate throughout our community, and eventually you have to accept credits back from someone who wants shoes. So it's just a matter of creating a space in time for the reciprocity to be completed. I talk about the reciprocity circuit in my books. It's a matter of circulating the credits throughout the community, and eventually the creator of the credits, you who bought my bread, accepting it back in payment for what you have to sell, namely shoes. So really, the reciprocity in the exchange process is very simple. It's just a matter of keeping a ledger.
So wait a moment, about that reciprocity. There is one point in there that I wanted to ask about. You mentioned that I issue some credit, and I understand why you would take my credit because you accept my credit as a personal relationship that we have. There's a limit to how much you would accept.
Right.
And in the cryptocurrency world, it's called a trust line. So I may extend you a trust line of $20. Let's say the trust line is denominated in dollars. And when you've exhausted that trust line, in order to reset it, you must actually send me $20 on some sort of ledger. It could be a bank, it could be something that we trust more than this one-to-one relationship. My question is, you said that money is credit, and I completely agree. My question is more about the transference relation, of the trust. So you trust me for a certain amount, but why would a third party trust my credit? They've never met me. They may not be able to go after me for services, let's say, and especially on the internet, they might never meet me. So you've got my IOU. Is there, in other words, here's my question. Does my credit have a price and a strength based on trust, my trust rating, that extends more and more? Like a bank in a local area, I could trust the money. And then further out, Mark Twain used to call it wildcat money, with the wildcat banks would print something and you don't know if that bank's around anymore or that producer's around. Can you talk a little bit more about how the trust is preserved as it goes around that circle?
Well, it's not just me trusting you. We're talking about an organization now. We've organized a fairly large group of prosumers into a trading circle where we all agree to use these credits as our payment medium. And so there has to be a way of determining how much credit you merit in this circle.
Mm-hmm.
And that will be based on your production and sales history. So it's basically an algorithm applied to each participant in the exchange organization. And the algorithm is heavily dependent upon your trading history. So if you sell typically $1,000 worth of shoes a month, you might qualify for a line of credit of $2,000 or $3,000 before you max out on your line of credit. If another person sells $10,000 a month, typically, they would qualify for perhaps $20,000 or $30,000 line of credit. So basically, we're monetizing within the circle the production or the production capability of each participant. The more you produce, the bigger your line of credit. And the bigger your line of credit, that means the more that you can spend before you need to earn. So the way the money gets created is by someone with a line of credit spending it into circulation, that is, buying goods and services from someone in the association.
Someone who trusts
This is
their IOU.
a perfectly sound way of allocating credit, and it's typically done in commercial trade exchanges, which have been operating successfully for 50 years or so. Basically, commercial trade exchanges have a few hundred to a few thousand members that participate in this moneyless exchange process. It's just a matter of keeping a ledger and allocating credit lines to each participant in the way that I described. So when someone buys something, someone with a line of credit buys something from someone in the circle, their account is debited, it goes negative. And when someone sells something, their account is credited, it goes positive.
That account that you're talking about, it's stored on a community ledger, so the whole community will be able to see how much credit someone's used up, or is it
Well,
only
the rules are varied. It depends on the agreement amongst the members of the association, whether they want to make the ledger open or not, or assign control of the ledger to a small group or individual. So this is an important consideration. What is the proper form of organization for a credit clearing exchange? And typically, commercial trade exchanges are operated as proprietary, small for-profit businesses, either incorporated or not incorporated. And so the control of the ledger is in the hands of the trade exchange owner and operator. There are trade exchanges that are cooperatively owned and managed by an appointed management group. But we could have an open ledger, which is accessible to everyone in the group. I think that might be something worth looking at.
Right. So you've mentioned that there are two options here: an open ledger that's open to everyone in the group, or a trusted third party, if you will, like an operator of an exchange.
All right.
For a moment, let's talk about the trusted third party, and then I'd love to talk about the open ledger, because I feel that cryptocurrencies enable exactly the open ledger. And Intercoin specifically, for example, my project is talking about exactly open ledgers for communities. So you can see on the ledger, everyone can make the decision together. But first, I want to talk about the first option, concentrating the decision-making power, again, in the hands of the owners, to which you delegate this ledger that you may not be able to inspect at a moment's notice when you're extending credit. When you're an employee and you decide to work for this or that company and you accept their IOUs, with a third-party ledger that's open to your community, you'll see, okay, this person's got this much. You might not even understand everything, but it will tell you the summary on your phone. The other one is essentially you're trusting a third party. So my question is, our system, because computers have only become prevalent in the last few decades, and then the internet has come around and so on, and now we have the blockchain, but our system was set up before. And so we needed to trust the post office to deliver our mail, and we needed to trust elected representatives to have our interests at heart when they're voting, and so on. We delegated these decisions to others, And in a way, when we run an organization like a community, we elect people, a mayor, and then they appoint some bureaucrats, and they decide the monetary policy. So in the system of the credit clearing exchange being owned by and operated by a group of people, how is that different than a bank making the decision to extend credit to you based on your past history and underwriting and looking at your, your statements going back and your accounts receivable aging reports? How are the two different?
Well, it's a matter, first of all, of scale. Each commercial trade exchange is in competition with other trade exchanges. So if I happen to own a computer shop and I'm being recruited by a trade exchange to participate in their credit clearing circle, I'm going to want to know how well that trade exchange is managed. I want to know whether they're inflating their internal credits by over allocating. I'm going to be very cautious to begin with in selling my computers to trade exchange members because I want to make sure that I've got the opportunity to get something I need from the members of the exchange. So I can limit my sales until I'm confident that I can spend the credits that I earn. There have been in the past, of course, a lot of abuses within that industry, and the trade exchanges that have been abusive have typically gone out of business because of, it's a matter of the flaws being discovered fairly quickly. The ones that survive are the ones that give good service to their members. And I think it's still possible within those trade exchanges, when I'm contemplating a sale to a fellow member, to ask what the trade balance is for that member before I decide to make the sale. That's one thing that I can do.
And how are you going to do that with the privately held ledger that's operated privately?
I ask the operator for that information.
But how do you know that information is?
Can I be sure that I'm getting accurate information? Yeah, well, there are no trustless systems. I mean, you have to trust something or somebody in every situation. When I board an airplane, I have to trust all the systems that it went into building that airplane, making it safe, and putting competent people in charge of its operation. So there's a whole lot of trust in everything we do.
There's absolutely a lot of trust with the banking, where you ask for the credit rating and you trust the credit report of this the credit rating agency. Absolutely.
Yeah, and we see that even those are not to be trusted. Again, citing The Big Short, we saw that the bond rating agencies were derelict in their duty at best and fraudulent at worst.
That's right. Even the Lehman Brothers audit, Lehman Brothers declared bankruptcy after the auditor said everything's fine. I think something like that.
Yeah, so you can't trust the big 8 accounting firms either. So
okay, so that's the breakdown.
That's what I'm saying.
I think
civilization is breaking down because the systems have been totally corrupted and people are appropriately losing trust in them. So, we have to reconstruct civilization from the bottom up based on proper incentives and systems.
So I completely agree with you about the decentralization of power and giving it to the hands of local exchanges and communities. Everything you're saying about the breakdown and the 2008, crash, let's say, and the fact that even the auditing agencies were not to be totally trusted because the incentives were not aligned, and the fact that people got bailed out when they shouldn't have been bailed out, and so on, because they were too big to fail. That's what led to the creation of Bitcoin And I consider this to be the Web 3.0. So Web 1.0 was about publishing information, and it decentralized the ability to publish information. So before Web 1.0, I needed to have a radio station or a TV station or a newspaper or a magazine, some sort of infrastructure and distribution agreements to publish and distribute my newspaper. And all that got replaced with the internet, with a protocol called HTTP. And essentially it was able to disseminate information using other protocols to send signals. But the HTTP allowed websites written in HTML and later with CSS, images, and so on, to be published. So little by little, people were able to, instead of having access to infrastructure, anyone in the world would be able to put up a web server that listens for HTTP requests coming in from anywhere in the world, and is able to publish a hyperlinked website, and they all hyperlink to each other. So it transformed the world, where the world we're living in today takes it for granted, but newspapers had a limited geographic region, usually, where they were circulating. And radio stations had to have syndicates, and the signal had to go. With the internet and packet switching, things changed. So not only can we do this video right now practically for free, whereas 20 years ago we needed to pay $3 a minute for the voice over IP became almost free. And with the web, it gave power for people to publish, which previously could not. So the geographic reach increased, and the means by which you publish changed from having access to infrastructure and institutions and old boys clubs to having anyone can throw up a code. So that's one. Okay, that's Web 1.0. Web 2.0 was about not just consuming information on websites, but producing. So it's called user-generated content. So people publish comments, and then they started to collaborate, communicate, write Wikipedia, and the kind of thing where you don't just read, but you write to the database. And so Web 2.0 essentially also changed the world, because now people on Facebook are able to find out other people, connect in all kinds of ways, okay, and have online events. And now with Clubhouse, for example, the trend continues. So you can have voice and follow people, and Twitter you can follow, and so on. All of these systems have essentially transformed the world and continue to be disrupted, continue to evolve. So now a third one is Web 3.0, and that's transferring value. Before, people weren't able to transfer value through computers because the double spend problem. In other words, I have a file and I can copy the file and I could send it to 1,000 people. And all those 1,000 people are none the wiser that I had sent it to the other 999. So if you extend to me credit in a credit money way, I could tell you I'll pay you back $10. And you think, oh, it's only $10. But what you don't know is I've also said that to 100,000 other people. And so that $10 is practically worthless because I've overextended myself. So people have invented third-party ledgers, and Bitcoin was the first one, but it's only the first generation. But Bitcoin has become the face of cryptocurrency, Web 3. So the third-party ledger is essentially a shared data structure, and everyone can see it in the world. And you can only make transactions based on the rules. With Bitcoin, the rule is simple. If you don't have the money, you can't send the money, right? So it's only, if you don't have the Bitcoin balance sufficient to send, the transaction fails, okay? So that's Web 3.0. And what I want to get at is that Web 1.0, 2.0, and 3.0 have early projects and then have an evolution. So Web 1.0 had search engines like Alta Vista, Ask Jeeves, all these things, and then it became Google and Bing, okay? Web 2.0 had Friendster and MySpace, and those were pretty good, but now we have Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, Clubhouse, Telegram. So things improved, or shall we say, things became more adopted this way. So with
you also had the evolving monopolization of those channels. So as those channels became more and more dominant, it became possible for them to censor you, as I've been censored on Wikipedia and to some extent on Facebook. And so, it's a continual battle to keep the internet open and the World Wide Web free and accessible to everyone, and not have your voice muted. But to get back to your double spending problem, within a credit clearing exchange, that isn't a problem, because within a credit clearing exchange, the credits are always on the ledger. They can't be taken off the ledger and go to some uh, some offshore haven where you can hide them out. Uh, if a fraudulent or improper transaction is detected, that ledger entry can be reversed. And we're talking about continual participation. Bad actors will be expelled from the association if they repeatedly violate the agreement.
So wait, so that's
So,
very interesting. I want to ask about that because everything you've been saying until now, it seems that cryptocurrency was invented as a response to having to trust, as we said, these auditors and these rating agencies. And the people said, no, we want the people's ledger. We want something that is accessible at a moment's notice. If you're sending me Bitcoin, I want to know that you have that balance, that amount to send. And when you send it to me, it has to be on chain, as you say. We don't necessarily give a lot of credit to off-chain transactions. The large ones are settled in on-chain transactions. So, but now you've mentioned something in your vision that is different than the cryptocurrency space. In the cryptocurrency space, there is no reversal of transactions, and there is also no association or gatekeeper that can kick you out and confiscate your credit or your money. There is only individual decisions based on if I want to make a transaction with you or not. And so who is going to decide to kick somebody out of essentially the association? I'm just curious because with Intercoin, there's sort of this, we're serving communities. So there is a governance idea that someone may be demoted or the community may not want somebody to move all their money out. They have capital controls. So there is a bit of a tug of war, but it has to have clear rules. Who decides if someone is part of the exchange or not part of the exchange, and who can decide that they get kicked out of the exchange?
well, it's all it's all part of the agreement. In my most recent book, The End of Money and the Future of Civilization, I have a model agreement for credit clearing exchange. It's it's not something at the whim of someone. It's a matter of are you adhering to the agreement or not? And if you're not, then there are consequences. But basically, what I see as the Bitcoin phenomenon, it was an attempt to deal with this impersonal, centralized monetary system by reverting to commodity money.
Yes.
Bitcoin is it's a virtual commodity. It's created through a process of running computers through an algorithm of some sort and coming up with a solution and getting paid in Bitcoin for having done that. So it's very much like gold. And Nathaniel Popper's book, Virtual Gold, is an excellent book that makes that parallel between gold and Bitcoin. So let's talk about Bitcoin as virtual gold.
Mm-hmm. I think it is.
When the exchange process evolved, we can say that for impersonal relationships in transacting business, we went from barter to commodity money to symbolic money, where commodities were deposited and credit instruments issued on that basis to complete credit money and now to credit clearing. That's the evolution of the clearing of the reciprocal exchange process that I outline in my books. So Bitcoin is actually a reversion to commodity money as a way of trying to address the flaws and the mistrust that we have in the dominant money system, the fiat money system. So yeah, it can serve to some extent as a stopgap, but it's not the ultimate solution. Now, where virtual commodities like Bitcoin might play a role is in transborder payments and remittances. So, for example, I can see if I want to trade with somebody in a different trade exchange than the one that I belong to locally. Let's say I want to buy something from someone who belongs to a trade exchange in Britain. Now, there are different ways to network trade exchanges together. I think in order to keep the trust level at the local level, we need to keep local trade exchanges relatively small. But we have to have a way of networking local trade exchanges together on a wide area basis to make them more useful. In fact, eventually make them globally useful so that I can use my credits here in my local Tucson exchange to buy something from someone in London in a London exchange. So how do we do that networking? We can have a hierarchy of levels. We can go from local exchanges to citywide exchanges, to regional exchanges, to statewide exchanges, to national exchanges, and to global exchanges. So we have several layers, but at each layer, we have to have an algorithm that sets the credit limits for each exchange, for each level.
So you see these exchanges as themselves having their own account in the next level
Yeah.
system.
Right.
I just want to say that what you just described is uncanny because that's basically the design of Intercoin. Essentially, there is a, if you will, commodity currency, Intercoin, like Bitcoin, in the middle, and then you have communities. So what you call exchanges, it's called communities in the Intercoin system. And essentially, you start your own community to represent an existing economy or to start a new project, maybe. And it starts from zero. And as it gets adopted by the merchants in your city or vendors in your whatever online community you have or whatever service providers, they adopt the token of that community. I think it's almost the same as long as your exchange, your credit clearing exchange, what you've been saying, has one ledger shared among everybody, and it has one unit of account. So whatever that unit of account is, that token of that credit exchange, that's essentially Intercoin. Communities on the one level, and then between communities you have, we only have two levels. We don't have cities, states, etc. We just have the community that decides their monetary policy together, where they decide how to operate their community within. And then we have the intercoin, like the internet, and it's designed like the internet, basically local area networks. And then you have the internet. Same here, you have the local communities and you have the intercoin. And essentially that's, the idea is that the intercoin is used to settle between communities their debts, and within the community, the debts are settled in the local coin. So is that pretty much your vision? Is that kind of matches pretty much everything in it?
Well, another part of my vision is common credit allocation protocol. part of the agreement among the exchanges would be that we would all allocate credit using the same basic principles and protocol. So this would make sure that exchange A does not overissue credit in relation to exchange B. So we make sure that we're following the same basic procedures. It's just like when a bank wants to issue a Visa card or a MasterCard, there's a massive agreement that they have to adhere to in order to qualify to use that shared brand. So
No, what you're describing here, the protocol that's shared, is actually the second generation of Web3 cryptocurrency. That's Ethereum and smart contracts. So I just want to quickly outline. So cryptocurrency started with Bitcoin, we could say. Bitcoin solved the double spend problem in a way that wasn't very scalable. It can't handle many transactions at the same time. Actually can handle extremely few, but it's very secure. So it's mostly used for settling large amounts, like what you're saying. It could be settling the trade imbalance between New York and Paris, let's say. So that is Bitcoin. Ethereum generalized the system of mining blocks and putting them on the blockchain by saying, why have only one type of transaction, which is to say moving money from A to B? That's really boring. If we have a system that we call trustless, meaning you don't have to trust an individual entity. You're right. When you go on an airplane, there's lots of moving parts and you do have to trust a lot of things. But when you're doing one thing only, which is moving money on a public ledger, the computer scientists have come up with ways to do a consensus between all these computers around the world that don't know each other, don't trust each other. And one way to do consensus, which I would argue is actually pretty unscalable and wastes a lot of electricity, is proof of work mining. Proof of work consensus. So you get a consensus about every transaction in the world is going to go on this block. And if you don't pay enough money, fees, you're not getting on that block. So it's a very limited space, but it's expensive, but it's secure. So that's how Bitcoin works. Ethereum said we could have multiple types of transactions. We could have computer languages, which they call Solidity, and so on, instructions that are executed on essentially a virtual machine. So typically when I write some computer code, it's executed on my computer or on one computer, maybe a server, but it's executed on that one machine. With Ethereum, it's actually executed on all the computers and it costs a lot of money. It's like a glorified mainframe, except the mainframe is being run by 10,000 computers. One of those computers solves the finds the block, mines the block by solving the hash problem. That block doesn't contain, transactions only moving money. That's Bitcoin. But it contains transactions of the type of instructions like store this in this variable, add this, subtract that, concatenate two strings together of text, and so on. So what you're talking about, having a common protocol, would be expressed in what is called a smart contract. It's essentially a program written on a programming language that runs on this blockchain. And therefore, what it opens up is a world where you no longer have to trust anyone, in the sense of you don't have to trust a bank or an auditor to do some operations and report to you the result. Instead, you only have to trust that these 10,000 computers are going to execute your smart contract exactly as it has been written. So if your contract says that reject the transaction if this is the case, or that balance is less than that balance, move this to that, and so on, that's what Ethereum is. So it's a second generation of Web3, which basically generalizes the transactions from move money A to B, that's only one type of instruction, to basically an arbitrary, so it allows people to create governance mechanisms that you can trust are taking place. Like there's no way for me to violate the smart contract if I get in there and I interact with it. So is that kind of, if that mechanism is now available, do you see that as being useful to implement your vision for these protocols, for these between the trade exchanges?
Okay, well, I'm still not sure about that. What I may see here is the possibility of using a crypto token as an armored car. So you got money, you want to move from point A to point B. You hire an armored car to pack all this money in terms of bills into the armored car and make sure it gets safely from point A to point B without interference. I can see using Bitcoin or some artificial commodity to achieve that purpose. I'm not sure about the rest of it. You know, I may be wrong about that, but I'm still looking for answers.
Yeah, look, the cryptocurrency world is evolving, and it's only in the last 5-6 years that Ethereum really took off, and these projects of smart contracts took off. So I just wanted to kind of walk you through what's happened in the last 10 years. So Bitcoin solved the double spend problem, but like I said, it solved it in a brute force way, and it just happened to be the first mover. Ethereum allowed to use the same mechanism of a blockchain, but instead of moving money in an armored truck, you can now move instructions. And these instructions are not just about moving, but they're rather about accomplishing whatever logic you want to do and being confident that no one can mess with the logic. I'll give you an example. With my first company, Cubics, we build social networks for communities. So people can write a text message to each other. People can, vote in an election. But here's the problem. If they vote in an election on on a regular web server, and somebody can go into the database of the web server, MySQL or any other database, they can edit anything in there. They just need one key to get in and they get access to the whole thing.
Mm-hmm.
With blockchain, there is no master key to the whole thing. There is no. What you do is instead, you have a key to your account and others have the key to their account. And the accounts are merely variables or virtual addresses. And so the logic of the system, the business logic that says, if I'm eligible to vote within this block of time, put the vote, calculate, multiply, do this, do that, come up with a number and use that number for some other purpose. For example, I can vote for how much universal basic income to give out based on the price of food and clothing and books. And I may say, I want to subsidize 100% of food, but I don't think having books is a human right. Go buy your own books. I will subsidize 5% of your book, of the average cost people spend on books per week. I can do that as one participant, and then other people can do that as themselves, and we can average everyone's votes together on chain and use that value to manipulate the amount of UBI to give out on a daily basis. So that's one example of using smart contracts, whereas previously we would need to have a trusted third party to collect all the votes and really trust that they're not going to mess with the data. Now,
okay, yeah, I can see that, but how does that relate to the allocation and creation of credit? Credit creation is one thing. UBI is an entirely different thing. The purpose of a currency, which we're talking about credit, internal credit currency in a trade exchange, it has one function, that is to facilitate the exchange of goods and services that are already in the market and available to be sold and bought. A currency does not solve the distribution problem. The UBI is intended to solve the distribution problem. A currency cannot solve the distribution problem. That's a different kind of problem, you know.
So let's look at this. So the currency solves the problem, as you said, of a means of exchange, a medium of exchange.
Right.
Now, a UBI is about distributing money or currency.
It's about distributing the product, the total production, the total product of production, which
Well,
is
yeah,
represented by money.
right. So the representation of that is money. So by distributing money, you're distributing purchasing power to
Right.
people. Okay. So if you're distributing purchasing power in the form of a currency, of some currency, the question becomes which currency? So for example,
The
right now,
question becomes, whose account do you tap to give out that currency?
yeah, that could be one way to do it. So here, I'd like to share my screen. You see my screen here? I'm going to show you.
Yeah.
Very interesting. So first of all, we have a growing movement of mayors around the country who want to give UBI a try. They want to implement UBI. And here in New York, I don't know why they don't have it, but there's Andrew Yang. You know why they don't have it? Because he's not part of this organization.
I know Andrew Yang. I followed him during the presidential debates, and I like him. I think he's a bit naive in some cases, but that's another question.
Yeah, I think Andrew Yang's idea of a UBI, it enjoys support from both the left and the right. Milton Friedman on the right supported a negative income tax. And he said it was a way to liberate people from government welfare systems, which essentially gave them a disincentive to take on low-paid jobs and learn on the job and all that kind of stuff. You might reject the job because you're going to lose your benefits. So that's a right-wing point, is that
Well, how did he propose to fund that?
he proposed to fund a negative income tax
With a positive income tax, right?
well, of course, yeah, it's a scheme of redistributing money. Absolutely.
All right, so it's a redistribution.
It's a redistribution.
Yeah, I go along with that, but
On
the
the other
government
hand-
ought to be collecting enough to pay for it.
Well, yeah, and we're going to get into
As
how.
I said before, there's never enough money in circulation for everybody to pay what is owed to the banks. So you have this inherent imbalance in the money supply that allows the banks to reap tremendous profits in the form of interest income. And there's never enough money available for total reciprocity to be completed.
So as you see, with the banks issuing the money, they get to extract rents on the money that they issue in the form of interest and other things, and they get to pick winners and losers. With a UBI, essentially one of those things goes away. You don't pick winners and losers anymore. There's no elites that decide that this business qualifies for a loan and that business does not. Instead, who decides are the consumer. So the consumer gets the UBI, and if they want to patronize this or that merchant, they can. And so
Yeah, but
after
who's paying for the money that they're allocated?
okay, so that is a separate topic, and it's going to
Well,
take.
that's the crucial point.
It is a crucial point, but it's a complex topic. Just to summarize the answer, there's multiple ways to pay. There's multiple ways. Let me summarize by just listing some of the ways, but I want to get into that topic right after this, okay? Because that is an important topic, who pays for it, right? But again, you can also ask who pays for the bank issued money, right? And the answer is it's a system of control. They make you keep the money in the bank so you have enough reserves so they can issue enough money to others. And Bitcoin almost threatens that, because then people have a
They don't
self-governing
really need
wallet.
reserves anymore.
Yeah, people can opt out of the system now, and they can hold Bitcoin in their wallet, and nobody can inflate their currency, the Bitcoin. So in that sense, it's a commodity that lives in your phone. And unless someone hacks into your phone, they won't be able to take your money. That's a new way of thinking, and it does threaten the federal central bank's ability to print to issue debt.
Well, it threatens the banking monopoly in the same way that gold and silver threaten the banking monopoly.
That's
You
right.
know, more than 100 years ago, it was a political issue, bimetallism. William Jennings Bryan ran for president on a platform of making silver a monetary metal, and instead of having a single standard of gold. And basically, that was a way of giving people an opportunity to bypass the money monopoly by mining silver and trading silver and using it as a payment medium. So Bitcoin is very much like that.
That's right. There's Bitcoin, and some people say Litecoin is a silver, or Bitcoin is a gold. There are so many different cryptocurrencies, but the
Yeah,
difference is that, but here's the difference between cryptocurrencies and banks. Banks are governed and owned by the people in charge of the bank. So there are, for example, ways to reverse a transaction. If someone does a chargeback and they call the bank and they say, I didn't mean to make this transaction, or my card was stolen, then the seller.
Bitcoin is pretty much monopolized by the big miners.
Yes, I agree. Like I said, Bitcoin is the first generation technology. We strive for decentralization and make sure that the internet is not controlled by 5 people or whatever. That's certainly true. And when we talk about Wikipedia, you have a similar complaint, and I'm going to introduce you to Larry as well, the co-founder of Wikipedia. One of the co-founders, and he has the same complaint as you've seen, and he co-founded it, but he kind of left afterwards. And after he left, he says that it has been taken over by people with, leftist ideas, let's say, more or less, but more to the point, it's taken over by elites. And so they decide what goes on and what doesn't go on, in a way.
But one of the main questions with so-called cryptocurrencies is, how are they created? How do they come into existence?
Mhm.
And what do they represent?
So the cryptocurrencies,
with Bitcoin, proof of work is actually solving this mathematical problem and being rewarded for it. Well, the work that ought to be rewarded is the work of producing consumable goods and services.
oh, I absolutely agree with you. All I'm trying to say is that's the narrative that they give. That's one way of looking at Bitcoin. But the real reason that they use proof of work is because they want to make sure you cannot reverse the ledger, the public ledger, by amassing too much clout or too much virtual points, but you actually have to do real computation, and it just becomes infeasible because the amount of computation you do has to be bigger than the rest of the network combined. So
Yeah,
that's why
I understand the blockchain.
Exactly. So proof of work is basically a straightforward way to make sure you can never go backwards after a while. It's just not going to happen. That's all it's about. It's the story that they tell you that it costs money to create a Bitcoin. That's a side effect. But the real point is that it should be infeasible to, if someone paid you $1 million, they want to make it infeasible after 30 minutes to reverse that, which is very different than banks. In a bank, you could do a chargeback 30 days.
Well, let's move on. We've already covered that.
Okay, so here's what I want to run by you. We have a lot of cities around the US, and these mayors, starting with Michael Tubbs over here, Stockton, he used to be a mayor. All these cities and their mayors and administrations are interested to make their own UBI for their own people. But they have a serious problem. And it's the reason why none of these mayors have successfully created a universal basic income. You see, they don't have the word universal here. They have essentially perhaps a pilot for 50 people or 100 people. But if you look at, for example, Ithaca, New York, this guy. He's a mayor. He's pretty young here. It looks like they're all pretty young, actually. Ithaca, New York, already had Ithaca hours. So Ithaca already had its own currency, but it didn't go over so well. It cost a lot of money to maintain, to print, and to
Yeah,
secure.
I've had a lot to say about Ithaca hours in my books and elsewhere, and
I'd love to hear what you have to say in brief about Ithaca hours. I mean,
well, I don't think we want to talk about that here.
okay. The point being that a local currency like Ithaca hours could be printed by Ithaca municipality. However, they're thinking of giving out federal dollars. The problem with giving out a currency that you don't print and you don't own is that you're going to run out of it. So it's unsustainable to be able to pay a UBI in someone else's currency. The federal government is the one who can decide to send everyone a $1,200 check. You're not. You can't create, you're not a bank, and you don't have the ability to just give everybody a $1,200 check. Now, having said that, one way to fund a UBI is what you asked, where does the money come from? One way to fund the UBI is through taxes. For example, Alaska taxes the fossil fuels that are extracted at the point of extraction. They say,
Yeah, that's the way it ought to be funded. It ought to be funded by tax on use of the commons, just as Alaska has been doing. But most municipalities don't have that option. They don't have control over taxation of the commons. The only level is the state level that has any taxing power, and they allocate part of that to municipalities, but the taxes are collected at the state level. But the federal government has basically pushed the states and the municipalities into a subservient position because they collect taxes at the national level and then allocate them back downward to some extent. That's the opposite of the way it ought to be. Taxes ought to be collected at the state and local level and allocated upward as needed for things that can't be handled at the lower levels. So, it's totally backward. And the UBI is just a way of trying to address the flawed system. But if we create an unflawed system, if we create a system that's fair to begin with, we won't have to use these gimmicks to try to deal with the side effects of it.
So I think you hit upon exactly the thing. You've described the problem. Local communities, whether they be neighborhoods, cities, and so on, are not the ones with the power to make the decisions for their own members. Instead, the decision.
Well, we do have the power. We do have the power to allocate our own credit as we choose. And that's why I've been focusing on this for 40 years, because empowerment of communities, individuals, municipalities, and states depends on our taking what Regal called the money power, which is the power to allocate credit to one another according to our own needs and desires.
So exactly. So when I started Intercoin 3 years ago, my goal was to solve this very thing that you say you've been focused on for 40 years, to leverage for the first time smart contracts on the blockchain to solve it, because this wasn't available in the past. This wasn't available to create this sort of shared ledger. So the Intercoin solves it in the following way. I'm just giving you some applications of it. There can be other applications too. The applications that we're concerned with here work as follows. Ithaca, New York goes back to issuing Ithaca coin or Ithaca hours or whatever they want to call it. They are the ones then with control over how they want to print this money. But who decides how much Ithaca hours to print and give out as a UBI? We can make it so that the community decides directly as a direct democracy. And they don't decide based on arbitrary notions, although that might even be
Okay,
fine.
let me interrupt. The community here is the traders who have agreed to deal in Ithaca coin or whatever you call it, because it's coming out of their hide.
Sure, that's fine. The community and the people who can vote could be
Basically,
greater.
what you're saying is that the universal basic income will be voluntarily allocated by the producers in the community.
Exactly. It's a bit, you're reminding me a bit of that speech in Starship Troopers where the guy says, the only people who vote, the citizens, are the ones who served in the army against the aliens. In other words, if you don't serve as a veteran, you're not a citizen. You don't vote. So similarly with you, if you don't produce things, then you're not, I guess you're not going to vote on how to redistribute the money.
It's the ones you're asking to pay for it that have to decide.
So that's fine. But then you could say,
Basically, you
look,
have a UBI
yeah,
that's based on voluntary contributions. Fine.
completely fine. And that's why Intercoin is completely agnostic as to who makes the decision. In one community, the decision could be made by the biggest producers in the region based on how much money they have taken in based on their goods and services. And the idea is the more you contribute to the community, the more say you have in how much UBI to give. Another community might say, look, everyone's a producer. A mother who takes care of her children is doing something positive. Someone who is
You can't just preempt. That's basically a taxation scheme. You're creating a community currency and saying the community is going to decide how it's going to be allocated, but it's the people that are actually selling real goods and services that are paying for it. So you're taking away from them the power to decide that.
No, I'm saying that the people who create goods and services also includes the kind of people who would traditionally not be compensated for their services. For example,
But they're not being compensated by the market. So
they're
this
not
is
exactly.
a reallocation scheme. This is the role of taxation.
The people who are raising their children, taking care of their elderly parents, the
I
people
agree
who,
that this is valuable work, but it's not in the market.
it's not in the market. And the question again is just a moral question of whether these people should be enfranchised and decide how much UBI to be given out in their community. Should they have a say as participants who do work that's not remunerated? Should they also have a say? So it's a matter of opinion. And some communities may decide one way, and other communities may decide another way. Intercoin doesn't take a position on who makes the decisions. It just gives you the tools for the community to make the decision. All right. Anyway, so the idea is that once you have your own currency, you can then give out a UBI in your own currency. And so if people vote to give more UBI, then you do monetary inflation of your own currency. And to counteract that, you have taxes and fees. So let's go over taxes and fees. Taxes can be positive too. Taxes can tax things that you want less of, like pollution, maybe noise pollution, maybe, activities that you want to tax may include pornography or other things that you consider to be harmful or have negative externalities, like, for example, factory farming. You can tax that, or plastic, production of non-biodegradable plastic. These are things that are externalizing the cost to your community, and you might want to internalize those costs with tax. By having a UBI, you are aligning the incentives of the public with levying that tax. So if a producer is producing non-biodegradable Coca-Cola bottles, right? They used to be glass, but now they're plastic. It's cheaper for them, but it hurts the community. Or like you were saying, putting lead in the water or asbestos or whatever. If you were to tax heavily, let's say you really don't ban anything, you just make it such a tax that over a couple of years, you just phase it out because it's too expensive versus the alternative. That tax would be redistributed to the people. And my point being that the way taxes are done now, when Macron in France decides to put a tax on fossil fuels, that tax falls disproportionately on the working class and the poor, because they have to get to work. They have to use fossil fuels to make a living. So they stage a yellow vest protest saying the idea may be good environmentally, but it's not socially progressive. However, if they redistributed the tax like Alaska does to the people, then the people would actually want more tax to be levied, because then they would get a bigger windfall.
Okay, we have no control over that.
Who is we in this case?
Well, we're not French. We don't. We're not the national government. We're talking about local communities and local currencies.
Oh, that was just an example, but the local community might want to tax certain activities like polluting their own water or like selling cigarettes to their citizens. They might want to have, which
Do
are
they
called
have the power to do that?
taxes. What's that?
Do they have the power to do that?
Currently, they don't, but if they issued their own currency, they certainly could take that currency.
And what do you think is going to be the effect on use of the currency if they do that? Now you're imposing a tax burden on a local currency. Why would a local producer want to use it?
Oh, I'd love to connect you with Warren Mosler, who I've probably heard of him.
Just answer the question.
I'll answer your question, but I'd love to connect you because he takes the exact opposite position. He says that there will be no demand for a local currency or any currency unless it's accepted as means of paying taxes, local taxes or any taxes.
Well, yes, taxes that are now collected in dollars.
So if the local currency can be accepted as a means to satisfy your city's tax requirements.
Well, what you're saying then is that the community, that the municipality is supporting the currency by accepting it in payment for taxes.
That's right.
So that's going to cut into their dollar revenue and substitute local currency revenue, which is fine.
That's right, but it enables them with one hand to collect the taxes and with the other hand to print more money to be used for productive use, either as UBI or infrastructure, roads, parks. So they print the money, but then they tax it back with the other hand.
Yeah, well, here's an example that I'd like you to look at. Kansas City is now making public transit free for all riders. And so basically they're paying the cost of providing public transit, paying that in dollars, and then making it free. My suggestion would be, why not get something for their money? Because there's lots of work that needs to be done, like park cleanup and graffiti abatement and other things that improve the community in different ways. Why not keep the fare, but collect it in a local currency and then pay out the local currency to people who volunteer to do the work of graffiti abatement and street cleanup and things like that. So, you know, they're already bearing the cost of the service. Why not get something for it and
Exactly.
put people to work in something productive?
Exactly.
So that's balancing the reciprocity circuit.
I think if you close the loop earlier, like you're saying, the circuit, instead of having the loop go into what happens now is these mayors are trying to give a UBI, and the $1,200 that people got earlier, and now the $2,000 or whatever they're going to get, people spend it on eBay, Amazon. They spend it on stocks. They spend it on cryptos. And it makes sense because they see there's a lot of money, and many of them don't necessarily need the money today to buy food. So they go, and there's an asset bubble now in everything because they're trying to park the money in something that will go up, and currently it is going up. So the thing is that the money is being given out, but my point being that if the city did that, if the city gave out dollars and the dollars were usable with Amazon, with Robinhood for stocks, all this stuff, it's going to leave the city. That money is
You
not.
don't want that.
You don't want that. You want to close the loop within the city, so the consumer goes to a local store, and the local store hires a local employee, and the money goes around in the city. That's what you want. So that's what Intercoin is about. It creates local community currencies that must circulate in the city because no one else will accept the currency.
Well, that could be in the form of paper notes too.
It can, and that's what people have done throughout history.
So the question is, how does a so-called cryptocurrency, improve over paper notes of local currency? What added functionality is being provided? That's always been my question, Greg.
Oh, so that's a great question. So first of all, if you interview the people that ran the Bristol Pounds and the Brighton Pounds and all these projects, they'll tell you it was too expensive. Just like administering a voting system is expensive, and federal governments can do it, but others, it's expensive.
Yeah, well, it's expensive because of the model that they follow. They sell it for pounds or dollars or fiat currency. They sell it, which is not the way that you decentralize control of credit. It's not the way you create local liquidity independent of the banks.
Oh, I agree with you.
You have to do it by allocating credit to producers and having them spend it into circulation.
But we agree on the problem. The problem is it's too expensive to have paper currencies, and you need to secure.
Well, it isn't. It isn't really, and it doesn't have to be paper. It could be ledger currency.
Well,
like
that's what we're talking about. If you have a ledger currency, you may as well make it electronic. And if you're making it electronic, you may as well make it decentralized, like a cryptocurrency. So
that's where I still have a question.
Well, if you make it electronic, but you centralize it in one database, then you have to trust the operator of the database not to corrupt the data. The point of crypto is to remove the need to trust the operators of the database. There are no operators.
Well, now we have to trust the crypto.
Well, yes, but it's easier to trust that 10,000 computers have not been corrupted than to trust that one has not been corrupted.
What's the overhead involved in doing that?
So Bitcoin, like I said, is the
effort?
initial. The overhead is, unfortunately, it's designed in a way that the overhead keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger. Bitcoin is designed to use proof of work. That's a first generation technology. But technologies are coming down the pike that are going to replace the underlying blockchain. Don't worry about the tech part. Let's just assume that the cost will be negligible and that you can send $10 with 1 cent fees. Let's say that is the case. Then in that case, do you see how the cryptocurrency would be preferable to a paper money, just from the point of view of cost, if that was the case, right?
Yeah, well, we don't have to do paper notes. There are some advantages to paper notes. People like them. They're used to using paper as a medium of exchange. Ithaca hours were initially quite popular because of the way they were designed. The same with Berkshires and the Bristol Pounds and all the others. But they're all issued in a way that, as I said, doesn't create liquidity independent of the banking system. Ithaca hours did sort of, but it was issued willy-nilly. Initially, all you had to do was come to a meeting and you would get Ithaca hours. You didn't have to necessarily produce anything. So the producers that were accepting it were accumulating a lot of Ithaca hours and not finding anything that they could spend it on that they wanted.
Right, they couldn't close the loop.
When you issue a community currency, it has to be issued on the basis of goods and services that are available in the market, and it has to be issued by the producers of those goods and services.
So I
Whether
totally
it's in the
agree
form of
with
paper notes or ledger credits.
So I totally agree with that, and it's fine if your currency wants to represent, basically kilowatt hours or whatever it is that you are producing, apples, right? I understand that. However, in the community, they have to be exchangeable one for the other. And what I'd like to ask you, and I think you mentioned the original kind of the granddaddy of community currencies, I forgot his name, but you mentioned that he had the idea of pairwise exchanges, and there is no central city coin into which everything is exchanged, but rather apples and oranges have their own, pair, and then apples with, bicycles have their own pair, and
Are you
bicycles.
talking about conventional barter?
No, but I am saying that there is no unit of account for the city, but rather the way you settle things is just pairwise. I forgot his name, but you mentioned that there's a way to do it without even referencing the dollar or any external one. It's just in terms of
I
pairwise.
don't remember saying anything about that.
Okay, I forgot what it's called. One second. Okay, it's called, my point is this: if you have a utility producing kilowatt hours credits, and you have a coffee grower producing coffee bean credits.
Okay, so you got coffee credits and kilowatt hour credits and um, wheat credits and okay, so where are you going with that?
So in Intercoin, the local businesses have a choice to be in the same community. Sure, the businesses can have their own community. So Chipotle is a franchise, they can have Chipotle coin, and they can have their own community of people who
Yeah.
like to eat at Chipotle and use
Okay.
Chipotle coin. Okay, but also Chipotle is part of New York City. Let's say someone decides to open a Chipotle in New York City. So they're part of the franchise Chipotle, but they're also part of the city. And so in that city, they might want to accept New York coin. And New York coin, like you said, needs to have a network effect. So what is a network effect? So when Facebook started in Harvard, let's say only 5 people used it in the first hour. During that hour, Facebook was not really that useful for the average Harvard person, or even for a user of Facebook, because there's
Yeah,
only
okay, I understand the network effect. What's
right. So when it saturated Harvard and got 50% of Harvard on it, it became much more useful. And there's like different ways to estimate. Metcalfe's law is overly optimistic, but it estimates it to be n squared. If there's n participants, then it's n squared value for each one. But with a currency, in order to get that n squared or n log n, whatever the value is, you need n to be as big as possible. So if you have only 5 people, it's not really that exciting, because let's say I do get paid in by Chipotle with Chipotle coins. Yeah, we covered a lot of ground. I think the main things that I was interested in, kind of find out your views. And it almost sounds like Intercoin matches almost all of them, and it implements your vision, except we may have some ways to, there are different ways to decide how to tax people, or who decides who to vote, and where the UBI comes from. But like, besides the idea that maybe there shouldn't be a UBI, maybe there should be credit issued by different groups, for the most part, Intercoin is capable of implementing the vision that you've set out, right? With the credit clearing exchanges being the city coin, essentially being denominated in the city coin. Would you say that's the case? How do you kind of see it now seeing?
I still don't know about that, Greg. I think your focus on UBI may not be the best thing for you to be doing. Because as I said, that's a solution to the distribution problem, not to the exchange problem. I'd like you to focus on the exchange problem and how you can help that.
Okay, forget about the UBI for a moment, because that's an application of the technology. It's a bit like running Photoshop on your Macintosh or your Windows machine. You don't have to run it. you can operate your machine without Photoshop and use other things. So let's talk about what is more fundamental. Intercoin lets any community issue their own currency. So that would enable your vision, correct? If every community was able to issue their own currency, then every producer would essentially could create their own community. Chipotle, the restaurant chain, could create their own coin.
Well, how do you involve the local producers in creating the local currency?
There are multiple ways. One way is top down. If you go to the mayors who want, like Andrew Yang, who's going to want a UBI, then you use the UBI as a way to get them to accept the currency. You say, look, all the citizens are going to get this local currency as a UBI, just like they come in with Visa cards in the 80s and 90s. And you said, what's this? Where's your cash? And they said, don't worry about it. Sign up with Visa and I'm going to frequent your store much more often. And if you don't do it, I'm going to go to your competitor. Same way, the
Well,
UBI is the way to do it.
In that case, the merchant knew that the banks were ready and able to pay.
Well, at the beginning, they probably were a little skeptical. So they probably did a little bit.
Anything new is going to be met with skepticism.
So in the beginning, they had to phase it in. And so I think it was the commercial was Visa everywhere you want to be, right? Because it was like the network effect was the thing that was advertised. And I had conversations like we're having with Stephen Thomas, who was the CTO of Ripple. And Ripple is a system for banks to settle their transactions. It's also a cryptocurrency. And later, Stephen Thomas started heading up his own company called Coil, which I'm not going to get into, but Interledger Protocol is an open protocol for people to pay between ledgers, similar to what Intercoin is doing and similar to what you're talking about, credit clearing exchanges settling their debts between each other. But I'm not, so Stephen Thomas is definitely about open systems, and they raised a $100 million fund with Mozilla to fund what's called web monetization. It's this interledger protocol. So, I spoke to Stephen Thomas. He said, you're doing everything right with Intercoin. That's exactly like the idea of what we wanted to do with Ripple and interledger protocol, but you're doing it for communities. He also said the reason for his interledger protocol is because the beginning stages of credit card companies was all about access. Visa is everywhere you want to be, right? Everyone's on this network, they're in the network. But now with the interledger protocol, it doesn't matter what network you're on because it's going to seamlessly convert this type of money into that type of money. So it's a way of essentially combining all the ledgers into sort of one big network and minimizing the fees of having to go from one to the other. That's his project. My point
So
being,
are you saying that Ripple is being used by banks to settle their accounts?
I would say that that's what it's designed to do, yes.
But it's not actually being used that way.
I'm not sure. I haven't done enough research. Some people say it is, and some people say it's not. I'm not privy to what the banks are doing.
Yeah,
But
I thought banks had their own way of settling accounts among themselves. That's
Well,
what
there's the SWIFT
clearinghouses were
system.
intended to do.
Did you hear that the Federal Reserve System was down for a few hours recently?
No.
So their computer systems had a glitch, and none of the ACH payments could go through for a
Was
few
it an
hours.
attack?
I don't think so. I think it was a misconfigured file or something like that. But look, most of the time they're fine. They use old technology like FTP and whatever, they settle their accounts in some way.
Yeah.
The fact is we all trust them. And because they have that position of power, they can declare monetary policy. They basically have the power, and we trust them.
Yeah.
With cryptocurrency, that power is being redistributed to the edges. Everyone's got their phone, and their entire Bitcoin wallet is only accessible from their phone with their private keys.
Yeah.
That's why it's an exodus from the bank to the phone as being the store of value for you. And as more people realize this, they move their money into crypto. And that's why the crypto space is constantly growing, because why store with a bank? when you
Yeah,
can.
well, people are concerned about inflation of the fiat currencies, so they want to get into something that's going to possibly hold its value. And like gold or silver or collectibles or diamonds or whatever you want to talk about, something real, uh, cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin are virtual commodities, and they're hoping that they will hold value. But, it's like the market for gold is manipulated by big banks and central banks and governments, and the market for Bitcoin is manipulated by the whales. So I don't know, pick your poison, I guess.
I guess. Well, look, every market's going to be manipulated, but the bigger the market cap, the harder it is to move the market with any kind of manipulation. So, yeah, maybe George Soros was able to break the Bank of England because they had to maintain a peg, but it's really hard to do something that on that level when the market cap is in the trillions of dollars. It becomes very hard to really make an attack on the market price of Bitcoin. I mean, yeah, right now there's still attacks, but I think the volatility has been going down. And over the years, the volatility is going to go to what it is between any currency pairs like euro and the dollar, whatever, eventually. Maybe not. It could be that Bitcoin gets more and more scarce because people lose their keys and people stake their bitcoins in some project, and so the amount of available Bitcoin constantly shrinks because it's being used for something or lost.
Yeah,
So
you have the same problem with Bitcoin as you have with gold or silver. You got to store it somewhere and you got to protect it and maintain your access to it. And if you keep it on your phone, yeah, you don't have to trust any exchange to hold it for you. You're trusting yourself and your phone. But if you lose your phone or if something goes wrong with your phone, it's gone.
well, yes and no. So there you can have backups. It's much easier to have a backup of an electronic file than to store gold in a vault, right? It's much easier to take delivery of Bitcoin and to maintain it than gold.
Can
And
you keep it in two different computers?
yeah, you simply have your phone backed up, right, to an offline storage somewhere.
Hmm.
So you can also do something else, which people aren't doing, but they should. You can split your key or your 12-word phrase into 3 parts. Put one in your refrigerator, put one in, bury it in your backyard, and give a third one to your mom, right, or whatever. And you can make some copies of it. So that, I could go to my mom or my dad and get one of them, and then I can go to. So
Okay,
there's
well,
ways
you compromise security a little bit that way.
Well, definitely actually more secure than trusting my banker to not freeze my account.
Yeah.
So that's Bitcoin. People who had problems with banks definitely appreciate it. But people get it for all kinds of reasons. It's better than gold because you can transfer it over the internet,
Sure.
the amount.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's a big advantage.
that's a huge advantage. But let's go back to, so the point I'm trying to make is Intercoin was started because of what you said. Bitcoin has a big advantage. Let's keep all those advantages, but let's create a monetary system that is not based on commodity money only. That's Intercoin. But then you have the community currencies that are based, like you said, on community decisions. Let's say by only the producers, forget the consumers, just the producers decide, we'd rather have people get free money. They're going to spend it in our city. That's not exactly how it's going to work, to be honest with you. Producers are not going to get together and say, let's put out free money, get people in, so they're gonna create more business for us. Yeah, maybe some people are going to do that, but I think the way that people are going to accept these community currencies is going to be the way they accept any meme or anything, is that it's going to be given out for free as a UBI to everybody. These people are going to go to the store and say, hey, I can pay for my chips, little purchases with this, right? And the store goes, I don't know what this is. It's like WeChat in China. I don't know what this is. give me money. It says, okay, but you know what? I'm going to this other store and I'm going to be purchasing from them. But if you guys, I really like your store, but you guys got to start accepting this. That's what happened with PayPal. That's what happened with anything. People said, let me pay you with PayPal. Hey, let me pay you with Bitcoin. What's Bitcoin? Oh, download this app and I could pay you with Bitcoin. And there's a growing number of things that you can spend Bitcoin on, right? So in the beginning, people were like, oh, I don't know.
Yeah, it's people's experience with it that determines whether it's going to scale or not. And if the experience is positive, that it will scale. If it isn't, it'll fade away.
Exactly. So in the
We
beginning,
have a lot of Let's systems that were started that faded away because they didn't have a lot of businesses involved in it. And so it was just casual trades among individuals who didn't have really much to offer. But
basically, that's the network effect. If nobody picks up on Facebook at Harvard, it fades away. If a social network doesn't take off, or a language, computer language, or anything, it fades away. But if,
so there has to be clear value to using it.
and the problem is that the value is small for the first adopters. The first people that had Bitcoin could not spend it on anything of value to them. So they had to believe in it, despite the fact that for a couple of years they didn't have anything to spend it on. But the more people bought Bitcoin, the more it went up in price. So one thing that they had, which was a weird thing, is that they speculated on it. They invested in it before it had any value. It's kind of like an investor putting money in a startup before the startup produces anything, right? So the first adopter,
well, like any commodity, it's more useful as a store of value or a speculative medium than as a payment medium. So as the price goes up, people are going to want to hold on to it rather than spend it or sell it.
and that's why Intercoin separates.
Like a bond or a share of stock or any financial investment.
Well, that's why Intercoin separates those two things. On the one hand, you have your savings account, which let's say that's your Intercoin. That's designed to go up in value as more communities join the network. Intercoin's limited to 1 billion coins, just like Bitcoin's limited to 21 million.
Mm-hmm.
And so it goes up in value, presumably, as more and more communities demand it for reserves, to hold reserves.
And what's the basis of creation for Intercoin?
Intercoin is essentially, suppose there's a billion tokens out there. Okay, there's a billion coins.
We've already created a billion Intercoins.
Yeah, let's say they're all created from day one. Yeah.
So
And
it's just a fiat.
it's not a fiat.
Let there be a billion let there be a billion Intercoin.
Well, that's the only act of creation, if you will, of these coins, because fiat, what is fiat? Fiat is the ability to put seigniorage and say, this piece of gold is actually worth more than the gold itself.
You can say that. That doesn't make it so.
Exactly. So fiat, the power of Congress and the Constitution to regulate the cost of these coins and gold or whatever, the seigniorage power was supposed to be given only to Congress. And that's the power of fiat, is to say that these worthless papers, these greenbacks, are now good for paying us taxes and tariffs and land taxes. And so they become a medium of exchange because there's a lot of, they become very liquid. Everyone needs to pay tax. Enough people need to pay taxes to the U.S. federal government.
So in that case, the fiat is backed by the government's willingness to accept it in payment for taxes, and the declaration by the government that says you must accept this currency even for private debts. Otherwise, you have no recourse in the courts.
Well, that came later. That came after the Civil War, right? They decided it was so good that now they're going to take away the recourse in the courts, and they make it essentially, like you said, legal tender for all debts.
Yeah, that's what legal tender is.
Exactly. So the legal tender laws came after the greenback was already very popular, and they cemented its place as essentially now then they got off the gold standard, and basically all you're left with is these greenbacks now. And that's what the dollar is. It's the greenback that became digital, and you got off the gold standard. And now you're going to have the digital dollar in a year or two. And it's all going to be just one ledger in the government's database, in the federal government database.
The greenbacks were issued directly by the Treasury, so they were outside the banking system. And they were retired following the Civil War. And eventually, all the US notes were replaced with Federal Reserve notes. I remember when I was young, there were silver certificates that were also in circulation. They were actually backed by silver on deposit and could be redeemed for silver.
So I think that's incredible. Like people went from commodity money to phasing it out. You had representative money with the silver certificates, and the banknotes were supposed to be backed by gold in the vault of the bank. But eventually,
fractionally backed.
Fractionally backed. Well, yeah, because the idea is that you don't need the entire, no one's going to cash out at once. Everybody's not going to make a run on the bank. And
well, they did, and that's why they created the Federal Reserve System to prevent bank runs.
Yes. So they pushed the problem one step
It's
higher.
one jury rig after another to try to keep the system alive.
That's right. Well, look, the fractional reserve system is always going to be there as long as there are people willing to take a risk in this world, right? I mean,
in today's world, there are no more reserves. Reserves are irrelevant today.
It could be, yeah. The Federal Reserve Bank, did you know this? The Fed eliminated all reserve requirements in 2020.
Yeah. And reserve requirements were eliminated in Canada long before that.
Oh, really? I didn't know that.
Yeah.
That's interesting. So who decides if a bank becomes over leveraged or not? Or why don't you just give out a loan to everybody then?
Well, I think the Federal Reserve, one of their roles is to allocate the money creation power amongst the different member banks. So, they have a handle on that.
All right. I'm just saying, if it pays to take such risks, why not just give a loan to everybody? And if you lose, you can't lose more than your shirt. So you just go bankrupt. But if you win, you're the biggest bank ever because you're growing, you're giving everyone a loan. Why not do that? Yeah.
It's a club, and the members of the club decide among themselves what the money creation power is going to be for each member.
Well, so that's our money system now. It's created by the elites who work for banks who decide who gets the loan. With the UBI, the reason I like a UBI, for the same reason that you like the credit clearing exchanges, is because I believe that the most productive producer and the most valuable producer should get the money, but that's determined not by the banking underwriters, but by the consumers who frequent their business. So yeah, I give them free money. Okay, I get that. But then the consumer uses that money at their favorite restaurant, at their barber shop. That restaurant earns the money by servicing that customer fairly and honestly, and they therefore should get that currency as a.
Okay, now you're talking about maldistribution of the total product, and that is a major problem. But we're not going to solve that problem with a currency until we take sufficient control back to the local community so that we have control over local production and can allocate it according to our own desires instead of the markets that are manipulated from above.
And that's exactly what Intercoin does. Intercoin tries to take all that control from above, whether it's the multinational corporations or the big chains or the globalization or the federal government. And it says, here, you're now going to have the tools to manage your own community currency, decide how much of it to issue with your monetary policy, and decide how to tax it back with your fiscal policy. And it's just a tool in your toolbox that to bring capital, because everyone who has your currency must spend it locally. there's just no one else is going to accept it. So that's basically what Intercoin does. It's against the forces of globalization, trying to help the local community exactly to do what you said that they need to do.
Well, what I described is the way to do that. And I'm not sure how Intercoin can play a role in that, except as perhaps a conveyor between this local exchange here and another local exchange somewhere else. You know, the armored car analogy that I used before. I know that Bitcoin is being used as a way of doing transborder remittances. If I want to send dollars to Venezuela, for example, I can buy Bitcoin and send Bitcoin, and then the recipient can sell the Bitcoin for Venezuelan bolivars or whatever their currency is called. So, you know, I can see a role for a smart contract using blockchain to make sure that it gets safely from here to there without any loss or interference. So a smart contract can say, okay, I'm buying Bitcoin now here and selling Bitcoin now there.
For example, it can do much more than that, but yeah, that's a use of the smart contract. But Intercoin is not just building the intercoin. In other words, you're right. The coin that's between communities is your armored car. It can be used to settle the debts between communities every day. Once a day, they can settle up an intercoin. That's one thing. And they use it as reserve.
It can be instantaneous, so that I'm not taking any market risk.
Exactly. Ripple does the same thing with banks. It's called XRP. That's like the ITR Intercoin. So they have XRP, Ripple.
Yeah.
And essentially, it's what they call the only counterparty-free currency. It's a currency that there's no counterparty issuing it. It's all been issued already. And essentially, the banks are just sending it to each other and denominating their debts in it, however they decide, however the market currently decides that's the price of it, the banks settle their debts in it.
You're talking about foreign exchange or banks using the same currency?
The banks could be in different countries. The banks could be local. It doesn't matter. They're all using the same currency, which is XRP. In other words, the banks don't have to have reserves of euros and dollars and Swiss francs. They basically just have XRP. That one currency is where all their debts are denominated in.
Well, I can see the usefulness of that for foreign transactions, but if all the banks are dollar banks in the United States, they've always done it just by tallying up who owes what to whom, and you might have hundreds of millions of dollars being cleared and only a tiny fraction of dollars needing to be transferred to settle.
Well, the Federal Reserve System does the clearing, right, in the United States. That's who does the clearinghouses, I think.
Yeah, I don't know who does it. Might be the Fed.
Might be the Fed. I think I read on Wikipedia that it's the Fed. Anyway,
why do they need XRP?
I think it's for remittances across countries.
Yeah, okay. So if it's clearing with banks in Britain or Germany or somewhere else, yeah, I can see maybe you use XRP to use the spot price on the foreign exchange markets to determine the different currency values.
That's what Intercoin is about as well. The main difference.
So you can use it as a settlement medium.
Yeah.
But again, the question is, what is the overhead? If you do it just with using the spot price on the foreign exchange markets between the dollars and the euro or the dollars and the pounds, why do I need XRP?
Look, I'm not. Many people ask, why does anybody need XRP? And you can also ask, why does anybody need Bitcoin when you have Litecoin and all these other coins? What's so special about any particular thing? Gold versus
we're talking about settlement and clearings now.
Right. I mean, people tomorrow could decide to use some other thing to clear their debts between banks. Who knows why people? It's a network effect. if more people decide to use XRP, if more banks decide to clear their debts using XRP, then it will become, in the same way that if more
Yeah,
people
but the
decide,
question is, why would they do that over what they're already doing?
why did people start to speak English over Latin? I mean, it happens.
You're begging the question, Greg.
Yeah, well, I don't know. I don't have all the answers to why things happen. I guess the marketing was better. Why did people use Facebook instead of MySpace?